2 billion became 12 billion, 4 billion became 31 billion, 50 billion became 216 billion. Three of Australia's biggest infrastructure projects have blown their budgets so badly that the overruns alone could fund an entire country's defense budget, and nobody got fired. Here is where this gets personal for every Australian taxpayer. These are not rounding errors. These cost explosions are now so large that they are pushing Australia's national debt past its COVID-era peak. The country that avoided recession for nearly 30 years is quietly borrowing itself into a hole, not because of a pandemic or a war, but because its politicians cannot stop announcing mega projects they have no idea how to deliver. Start with Snowy 2. In 2017, Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull announced a $2 billion pumped hydro scheme in the Snowy Mountains, 2,000 megawatts of clean energy. Australia's nation-building moment. The current price tag? $12 billion, a 500% overrun. Some analysts project the final cost will reach $20 billion. The tunnel boring machine they named Florence got stuck in soft ground for months. They are now considering a fourth boring machine just to rescue the project. Snowy 2 was supposed to be a symbol of competence. It became a symbol of everything wrong with how Australia builds. But Snowy 2 is not even the worst offender. That distinction belongs to Inland Rail, the freight corridor connecting Melbourne to Brisbane. Original estimate in 2010, $4.4 billion. Current projection, $31 billion. That is a 600% blowout. A government inquiry led by Dr. Kerry Schott found something extraordinary. The board overseeing the project, and I am quoting directly, does not have adequate skills to oversee this project. Construction had already started before engineers had finalized where the rail line would actually begin or end. They were laying track without a map. Then there is Melbourne's suburban rail loop, the most expensive infrastructure project in Australian history. The Victorian government originally pitched it at $50 billion. The official estimate has since climbed to $96 billion, but independent analysis suggests the real number is closer to $216 billion. Infrastructure Australia, the government's own advisory body, published a finding that the project's costs outweigh its benefits. The government's response? They stopped sending projects to Infrastructure Australia for assessment. And this pattern extends beyond these headline projects. Cross River Rail in Brisbane jumped from $5.4 billion to $19 billion, a 250% overrun, now delayed until 2029. Northeast Link in Melbourne blew past estimates by $10 billion. Sydney Metro doubled from $12 to $25 billion. MetroNet in Perth exploded from roughly $2 billion to $11 billion. Now here is what you need to understand. This is not incompetence, or rather, it is not just incompetence. There is a name for what is happening. Oxford professor Bent Flyvbjerg has spent decades studying mega projects worldwide, and he discovered what he calls the iron law of mega projects. 90% of them blow their budgets. 98% exceed a 30% cost overrun. This is not an Australian disease. It is a global one. But the cause is what makes this so difficult to fix. Flyvbjerg identified two forces working simultaneously. The first is optimism bias. Engineers genuinely believe their cost estimates are achievable. Every mega project begins in a fantasy where the geology cooperates, supply chains hold, and skilled workers appear on demand. The second force is far more deliberate: strategic misrepresentation. Politicians know the real cost would kill the project politically, so they lowball the estimate to get it approved. By the time the true cost emerges, contracts are signed, and cancellation would cost almost as much as completion. The project becomes too big to fail. That is exactly the point. The Grattan Institute put numbers to this pattern. Since 2001, Australian megaprojects have collectively overrun their budgets by $34 billion. And 80% of that total came from just 14% of the projects. A handful of massive failures are dragging the entire nation's finances into trouble. And the debt picture is no longer abstract. Australia's gross debt now sits at 51.9% of GDP and is projected to reach 57.5% by 2029. Interest payments alone consume 1.7% of GDP, rising to 2.1%. Every percentage point of interest on a debt that large represents billions that cannot go to hospitals, schools, or the services voters actually need. Victoria, the state building the rail loop, has already begun raising taxes to cover the shortfall. Land taxes, developer levies, car park levies, The cost of these projects is being quietly transferred from government balance sheets to household budgets. And there is another pressure almost nobody discusses. Australia faces a shortage of 197,000 infrastructure workers. More projects than workers means basic economics takes over. Every contractor and engineer can name their price. The labor shortage is not just a staffing problem, it is a cost multiplier baked into every project. Here is the part that should make every Australian uncomfortable. We use the phrase debt trap almost exclusively to describe developing nations that borrow from China for infrastructure they cannot afford. Sri Lanka, Zambia, Pakistan. But look at what Australia is doing to itself, borrowing billions for projects that consistently deliver less than promised, at costs far exceeding estimates, funded by debt that future generations will service. The only difference is that Australia is both the lender and the borrower. The trap is self-inflicted. And this is not uniquely Australian either. Britain's HS2 rail project jumped from 37 billion to 67 billion pounds and was eventually cut in half. Boston's Big Dig exploded from $2.8 billion to $14.6 billion. The pattern repeats everywhere Democratic politicians face voters. Because that is the mechanism nobody wants to name. Democratic politics rewards announcing projects, not completing them. A politician who announces a $50 billion rail loop gets the photo opportunity, the headlines, and the votes. By the time the cost doubles, they have moved on to a different portfolio or retired entirely. There is no accountability loop. The person who approves the budget is never the person who pays the bill. So Australia keeps building, not because these projects make economic sense. The government's own advisors have said they do not. But because the political incentive to announce always outweighs the political cost of the overrun, until voters start punishing blowouts the way they reward announcements, nothing changes. The question is not whether Australia can afford these projects. It is whether Australia can afford to keep pretending they cost what politicians say they cost. Because right now, the country is building its own debt trap, one mega project at a time. If you found this eye-opening, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into current events. Drop a comment below which mega project blowout surprised you most.